Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video. Long time no see. I just got done moving into my new place. So yeah, that's why I've been absent for quite some time. But we have a lot to catch up on. There's been quite a lot of developments, both with Shadow Priest and our various hero talents for the War Within. In this video, we're going to be kind of talking about Shadow versus Void. In particular, we're talking about Shadow Crash. So if you're not aware, they gave us a new version of Shadow Crash called Void Crash. And in this video, we're going to kind of go over what the differences are between that and Shadow Crash, when you might use one or the other, and a bit of feedback as well for the developers going forward. Let's dive in. Okay, so very basically, a lot of people were complaining that Shadow Crash can be kind of hard to play with, particularly inside of environments where mobs are moving unpredictably, either because of, tank or mechanics, whatever's happening, right? Shadow Crash can be kind of hard to target things correctly. Now, skilled players can kind of handle this, but this is particularly punishing for new players of the spec in particular, and a lot of people were giving feedback, including myself, for ways to make this less frustrating for people. And Blizzard gave us a new spell called Void Crash. So this is a choice node in our spec tree with Shadow Crash, so it's not like it costs anything. And you get to choose, do you want the old style of Shadow Crash or the new Void Crash? The difference is simply Void Crash is a targeted spell. So instead of Shadow Crash being like a ground reticle that you can place on the ground somewhere with the travel time, Void Crash, you pick a target and you cast it, and it flies towards your target at the same speed as Shadow Crash, and then will follow that target. If they are moving away, it will follow them, and then, explode under their position wherever that target is by the time it lands and hits them. So this is quite nice for a lot of people. This is what we've have been asking for. I like that they made this a choice node because I do think there are some intricacies here that could make it worse depending on the situation. But I think it's a really cool choice node that they added to the game. So let's kind of dive into kind of the pros and cons of these guys. Alright, so all of the interactions with these spells are the same, so that is definitely in the case of a pro. But if we start with Shadow Crash and just talk about good and bad parts of Shadow Crash here in the current state. So Shadow Crash is still really nice because you get controlled targeting. So this is really helpful if you can, exactly place it where you need to. Void Crash, on the other hand, you do have to find a mob that's where you want it to go. So that controlled positioning is going to be really important for these other couple points. And I'll give some examples as well. One of the other kind of placements with controlled targeting that's really nice is actually pre-casting with that. So if there are, in the case of like Sarkareth, or there's a few other fights of like Agira, where that a mechanic's going to happen at a very exact second, and you can pre-cast Shadow Crash at a location and hit them as soon as they spawn to make sure you don't have any delay with any sort of your damage. This is something that Shadow Crash just does much better than Void Crash, just because Void Crash, you need to make sure a target is, one, exactly where you want it, centered around all the targets that you want to hit, and then also that, there is a target available to do that. So definitely a big pro in Shadow Crash's case. You can kind of control where it's going, and you're not reliant on a particular mob being at the center of all of the mobs that you want to target in that 8-yard radius. So that's kind of the other pro with Shadow Crash, is really hitting, a group of targets that don't have a clear center. So if you have, for example, two targets that are kind of on the edge of the radius of Shadow Crash, well, you can do that. You basically split the difference, cast Shadow Crash in between those two mobs, and you can hit both of them. Whereas Void Crash, if you only targeted one of those, if they're too far apart, you do kind of have that dead zone where Void Crash is unable to get that because you have to target it on a mob. So there's a lot of those cases. You can probably think in your head of mechanics or raid boss encounters that this has happened where this is particularly awkward. You're probably seeing footage of Sarkareth in the background where you can see, there are ads spawning and then the boss immediately flies away. Well, if you're using Void Crash there, you have to wait until Sarkareth comes back to be able to use it. Otherwise, you're just not going to hit the ads. You could, of course, cast it on the ads after they spawn as well. It's just nothing is super clean compared to just pre-casting Shadow Crash where they're going to spawn. Now, Shadow Crash definitely has a couple of cons that you've probably already been aware of. So the biggest one is, Shadow Crash can miss. So, depending on movement of mobs or whatever, if you lob out a Shadow Crash and the mobs suddenly move or get, ring a piece away or something like that, or some mechanic happens where they suddenly move, that Shadow Crash is then completely wasted and it does nothing. So definitely a big negative for Shadow Crash. And the last one to bring up that isn't necessarily like, Void Crash isn't going to be immune to this, but Shadow Crash is definitely more susceptible to Z-axis issues. What I mean by Z-axis is, there's a kind of a Z-axis plane where, the game is actually existing. And depending on where mobs are situated on that Z-axis, particularly if it's not like a flat ground where they are, particularly on like staircases and that kind of thing, you'll notice that Shadow Crash can do really weird things where it clearly hit all of them, but because of the Z-axis issues, you didn't actually dot all of them or what have it be. So definitely a big con with Shadow Crash for sure. So flipping onto the other side with Void Crash, what are the pros for using Void Crash? Well, the big one is that, Void Crash follows the mob that you cast it on. So if a mob is moving and you're not quite sure what the movement patterns are, Void Crash is definitely safer in that regards. And I think from like a single target perspective, it's also just easier to use. You don't really have to think about it. You're going to press it. It's going to hit the mob. Whereas Shadow Crash, you have to be like, okay, where is my cursor? Make sure you cast it at the right spot, that kind of thing. So it is definitely simpler to use in some cases. The con there, though, is does that simpler use case make it the training wheels, so to speak, aren't really training wheels because it might be teaching you bad habits, and you might be missing out on some damage if you did place a perfect Shadow Crash at that spot. Now again, another con here with that targeted in the following bit, and this is kind of related to the first point. If that target ends up moving away, like Sarkareth, you could end up missing a lot of mobs as well. So the spells in and of themselves both have like good and bad things here. But I do want to kind of note that, I think it's going to be kind of a personal play style. But I do think in the current state, you're going to see a lot more people at the high end choosing original Shadow Crash just because of that like kind of pre-placement stuff and that kind of thing. Now, there's lots of things that I think they could fix here if they wanted to eliminate some of that stuff. I think there was quite a lot of pushback when they just straight up replaced Shadow Crash or were considering it, and we were kind of like, okay, just give us a choice node, please. We want the old behavior, which they reverted back pretty quickly. If we wanted to go fully into the direction of Void Crash, one thing they could consider is actually just increasing the radius size. Because the actual amount of targets that are dotted, and it's also square root scale damage, we're not super, we're not gaining a whole lot by getting extra radius, except making it easier to use potentially. So that could be one thing, if they increase the radius enough to make those issues that I was talking about, particularly with Void Crash and kind of centering on a target, there could be more situations where Void Crash just is better or makes more sense or is easier to use. But at the current 8-yard radius, it's just a little too small. So I think if they bumped it up to 10 or 12 yards, Void Crash would be a lot more popular. But let me know what you guys think. I know it does have a cool new animation as well that a lot of people are probably interested in. I know the Shadow Crash one is a little outdated at this point. But yeah, let me know what you guys think and what you're probably going to be using, or if you have feedback for the spell. I've already posted this feedback on the forums for beta, and I absolutely encourage anyone as well, if you do have access to it, post your feedback on the forums as well. That's the best way to see change. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.